Good morning, Nancy.
Good morning, Emma.
Thank you for being here with us this morning.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
I'm going to move this mic
Okay. It's my pleasure.
we really want to hear you.
Okay.
Okay. So this conversation came about because we are a community that's experienced some losses over these last couple of months. We've lost two members of our congregation, Lyle and Jeff, and we miss them a lot. And we thought that this might be a good time to talk about the last stage of life, and more specifically, hospice care. And you were a hospice nurse for a long time, which means she is a blessed angel. If you've ever had a hospice enter in your life in any kind of way, you know how remarkable the service is. And we thought this might be a good time to have this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Let's begin this morning with you explaining to us what hospice care is.
Hospice care is it's a philosophy of medical care in which death is neither hastened or prolonged. The aim is comfort, physical, spiritually, and psychosocially, rather than curative or healing, which is you find in other medical models. It's palliative. All hospice is palliative, but not all palliative care is hospice. The criteria for hospice is 6 months or less to live. But that doesn't mean you have to go off of hospice if you don't die. You can be recertified, they call it. And that is when you continue to decline, but and you've lived 6 months and they recertify you and you can keep doing that for as long as you need to. So we have people that are on for quite a while. It's a team approach. And it treats the patient as a unit. The patient and the family and the loved ones are as one, and we treat them that way. The team is a doctor, a nurse, a social worker, clergy, volunteer. Did I get everyone? And nurses' aides. Oh, we need those. Anyway, in hospice, it's often a time for patient and family to come together. They tend to want to reminisce and get their things in order and tell stories and iron out their differences in their families. It's just a good time to get together. They want to get their affairs in order before they die. The team has the skill, thank goodness, to help with families that fight, because that does happen under a lot of stress. They fight about money and about whether hospice is doing the right kind of care for their loved one. So it can be quite dramatic at that time.
Yeah. It's death is something that is inevitable, but is also enormously fraught, especially in our Western culture, the way we think about mortality. And hospice care can ease some of that angst. And we'll talk a little bit about more of those issues that crop up and what hospice care workers can do to help mitigate some of that. But first, I'd like to hear about how you became a hospice nurse.
Well, when I first got into nursing school, I was an OR nurse, and then I became an IV therapist. And those were all really good for me because you had your ducks in a row. You had a beginning, a middle, and an end to your tasks and your thoughts. And then I decided I'm going to go ahead and try my hand at the floor, the regular nursing floor. And I was terrible at it. My supervisor noticed, and I'm surprised I didn't harm anyone. So she said that, I would be great as a hospice nurse, and she wished I could do that. She talked to the hospice, the head of hospice up the street that was connected with the hospital, and she found out there was a night shift position. So I applied for that and I got the job. I was thrilled when I found out about it because I just loved it from the start. There was no chaos, and you're able to do a slow, thorough job, which they didn't like on the floor because I was too slow. And I got to sit with people and listen to them and help them cope with something that could be really difficult. And I could make something that's really difficult into something that can actually be joyous. I got to sit with people when they were anxious in the night, since I was on night shift, and sit in their room and do my charting in there and reassure Martha that I was still there and do my charting in between. And then I could let the people bring in their dogs. I'd sneak them in. They weren't allowed there at that time. And I just told them to make sure they're clean and don't have fleas, and you get them out before the daytime nun comes on. So that worked out well. I was in an inpatient facility, obviously, so I could do that. And it was just a joy. It was a pleasure and a privilege to take care of the dying and their families.
We've talked in preparation for this conversation about some of the unresolved things that can cause a person angst in the last stage of their life. My mother's late husband died of brain cancer, and he was a hospice patient in the last several months of his life. And I witnessed firsthand how some of those unresolved things can cause a lot of turmoil for the patient and for families, specifically conflicts between family members. If there's an estrangement or some sort of relational cutoff, that's something that can cause a person a lot of distress because they know that they're coming into the last stage of their life and they feel all of this anger and sadness and grief over these things that they've left undone. And you have a story about a particular patient who you cared about a lot, who was struggling with some of this. Will you tell us about Phyllis?
Phyllis, she was a great little old lady. She had gray hair. She put in a bun, and she had the best room. She was at the end of the hall and had lots of windows. And she'd sit up in bed with her oxygen on because she had lung cancer, and that helps you breathe to be sitting up a little bit. She and I would talk a lot because she was a very interesting lady. And on night shift, you have plenty of time to talk to patients, which was really, really cool. Anyway, she told me about being estranged from her daughter. And she was really upset about that and really uneasy and had a lot of angst about that. So I thought, well, Phyllis, why don't you write a letter not to be sent and then destroy it? So you can get these things off your chest and say things that you would like to say to your daughter without having to have her hear them necessarily. So she said, well, I can't write. I'm too weak now. So I said, well, how about if I bring in my computer on my day off? And you can dictate it to me. I'll write it down, which I did. And then I took it home and printed it off and to be edited the next day. She did so and read it to me. And then I took her in the wheelchair into the bathroom. And we sat there and we tore up each little piece of paper into little pieces and flushed them down the toilet. And we kept flushing and flushing and flushing all these little pieces of paper so we wouldn't clog up the plumbing. And I'm sure the people next door wondered what we were doing. But that really gave her a lot of relief, and she was really grateful for that. It was really nice. Then it was time for her to getting towards the end of life. And she was concerned that I not know about it when she was dying and couldn't come and see her. She was also concerned that she not get Little Bear back. Little Bear was this little bear that was my a stuffed bear that I gave to my dog at one point. He tore it up and stuff. So I stitched it together and ran it through the laundry and gave it to her because she was really fearful when I wasn't the one on shift. So she put it in her telemetry pocket and kept that close to her, and it really gave her a lot of comfort. But she was concerned that I not get that back. So they called me in when she was dying, and she was unresponsive. She was laying on her side. I went into her room and her family was there, including the daughter that was estranged, which was really special. And I went up to her ear. She was on her side, and I went up to her and said, "Phyllis, it's Nancie, I'm here." And she nodded her head, and that's when I really did believe that hearing is the last thing to go, because she could hear me and she knew I was there. And I just told her things like, it's been a pleasure to know you and a privilege to take care of you. And it's okay to go. I miss you terribly, but it's okay to go now. And your family's here. I'm glad to see. And it's more important that you be with them now. So I'm going to go ahead and go. And she nodded her head again. But otherwise, she was unresponsive. She wasn't talking or anything. And I left, and she had a very peaceful death.
You said something that I think is really important when you told that story about how we believe that hearing is the last sense to go when we're actively dying. And when I was a chaplain, one of the things that I always encouraged families to do when someone they loved was dying was to keep talking to them, keep talking to them. And if you have something that is unsaid, now is the time to say it. If that person has music that they love or poetry that they love, now is the time to play that music or read that poetry. Because we really do believe that up until really the very last moment, hearing is a sense that stays with us and we continue to process those things. We're going to talk a little bit more in just a moment about what it actually looks like when someone is actively dying, when they're in the process of death. But first, I want to talk about questions that folks might have as themselves or a loved one is entering hospice. We hear a lot, I heard a lot in my chaplaincy, misconceptions about hospice, this kind of fear that if you enter hospice, it's absolutely a death sentence and you're going to put the person in a room and lock the door. And if they ask for a glass of water, no, you can't have that, you're on hospice. That's not at all how it works. Hospice is actually really about compassion and comfort and the sort of joy and pleasure that a person might have and getting to experience that at the end of their life. So Nancie, what would you say are some common questions that folks ask when entering hospice, and what are the answers?
Well, one of them is exactly that. Am I going to die without food and water and be left alone? And I tell them, or we tell them, the team tells them that they will be attended more than they're used to in the hospital. And they'll get much more care and attention, and they won't be left alone, and they can eat or drink whatever they want. And with no restrictions anymore. It's wonderful. They just thrilled about that. We'll go to the ends of the earth to get them whatever they want to eat and do what they want. If somebody wants to smoke, we'll push their bed out into the patio and let them smoke. If a kid wants to go get high that has, a young person's cancer, we'll let them take their wheelchair down at the end of the driveway, past the foliage, and they can get high. And it was illegal, but we let them. As you know, I have sneaked in the dogs. I mean, why not do that? So no, they're not left to die. They also wonder about pain and suffering at the end. And we assure them that we have really good symptom control with meds and good physical care so that they don't get bed sores. We make sure they don't get skin breakdown. bathe them frequently and turn them if they're unresponsive and so forth. We also help them with their spiritual concerns by having a chaplain there, or clergy. And we have family education and empathy. And so no, we're trying to minimize suffering, and we have the ability to do that. So, and another one we get is, isn't it too early to get on hospice? Isn't that like a death sentence? And actually, it's ideal to get on early. And I have never heard a patient or a family say that they didn't wish that they had done that sooner. They really wish they had done that sooner. And they were so grateful for the care and the services they got. So another one is what services are provided. And you get the services of nurses, and hospital equipment is provided, such as a hospital bed and commode and things like that that are needed at the time. And symptom control, of course, as I say, pain medication and other medications, and then supplies to take care of them, to make sure that they're comfortable, their skin breakdown supplies and that kind of stuff. And they have one central phone number they can call with questions about how to take care of their loved ones, about what's happening with them, and for when they die, they call hospice. They don't call the hospital or the paramedics, because they might get CPR, which they don't want. So anyway,
yeah. So
room and board isn't paid for in the inpatient hospice. That's not paid for, but everything else is pretty much taken care of by insurance, or Medicare is very good about covering everything.
Yeah.
And then they ask, what if I can't make it in time to get there to see my loved one, to be with them when they die? And we say, you cannot do the wrong thing. The patient tends to choose when they will die. And so we tell them, if somebody's on the way to come see them, Uncle Fred is getting on the plane to come here, and we expect him to arrive. And a lot of times they'll wait and wait and wait for someone to be there, and then they'll die when they come. And then the opposite happens. The family will stand vigil over the patient and take turns being with them, so they're never, ever alone. And I remember a family doing that, and that we invited them to come out to the dining room, which was we had a big old house that was the hospice, and it just had a modern wing for the patients' rooms. And so we got them to go out there and have a break. And we told them, we'll let you know if anything happens, and you just take care of yourself for a minute, take a break. And that's when the patient dies. It's just remarkable that it's the way it happens.
Nancie, one of the things that we've talked about and that I encountered a lot is loved ones that are witnessing the actively dying patient often feel a lot of distress at what the process physically looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And in the last few minutes here of our message, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what it actually looks like when a person is actively dying, and how some of those symptoms may appear distressing to us, but are actually very natural and not uncomfortable.
Yeah. In the first place, hospice gives you lots of literature. They warn you, they give you easy to understand details about what the end of life looks like and the dying process and what to expect. So they do have, they're prepared when they enter hospice for that kind of thing. Some of the main ones are that they sleep more, they doze more when they're still with it, and they eat and drink less, and then that ceases altogether. And that is not an uncomfortable thing, like not getting any fluids. Dehydration is actually a natural anesthetic for the dying, in the dying process. And as far as eating goes, we are so conditioned in our society to show love with food that we educate the families about showing their love in different ways when they're not eating, by rubbing their feet and telling them they love them and that they have really appreciated them taking care of them and all that kind of thing. There's many ways to show your love without eating. And you can live a long time without food and water. It's really amazing. They always say, oh, it's just 3 days and without water, but it's just not in the dying process. They can live for weeks. And it's quite amazing. Another thing is they do is they withdraw from other people. And then often they see things that you don't see. Like they see loved ones that have passed and they come to visit them and they talk to them, and you don't interfere with that or refute it, because it could very well be true. They could really be there visiting, or it's certainly very real to the patient. So you go along with it and are happy for them that when they're happy that they get to see their relatives. And also you hear a lot of themes about traveling. Patients will say they've got to pack their suitcase, and or they've got to stand in line for the train. They've got to get their train tickets, things like that. And when they're seemingly unconscious, they're actually unresponsive. And that's when we talk about that the hearing is the last to go. So we encourage people to talk to people like Emma said. You get fevers a lot of time in the dying process. And a lot of times that's cancer patients, because they call them tumor fevers. And we treat that with medications to help lower the fever, Tylenol or whatever. And we put cold compresses on their forehead and ice packs on the back of their neck, and to reduce the fever so that they're more comfortable. Keep them dry if they're sweating, you know. And you get terminal restlessness, which is really interesting. People start picking at their covers and thrashing around in bed and trying to climb out of bed. And we would have to put beds out in the hallway when it was a full moon, especially, and watch them, make sure that they didn't hurt themselves. And sometimes it's from anxiety. Sometimes it's from unfinished business, and sometimes it's from regrets. But it's also a natural part of the dying process. It's a physiological change that they're going through. You can treat the anxiety with anti-anxiety medication if you think that's what it is, or you treat if you think they're in pain. You give them pain medication. You watch their furrowed brow or grimaces on their face, especially if they've been on pain sooner before, and give them more pain medication. And also, I learned tapping from a therapist, energy tapping, and on these two fingers, the first finger and the second finger, one of them shame and one of them is guilt. I can't remember which, but there was a man that was very, very restless and in dire straits, and his family said that he had cheated on the wife several times, and he is bad to the children, and so we encouraged them, of course, to forgive him, tell him that he's forgiven and that you understand where he was coming from at the time. And also I did the tapping on him with his fingers and talked to him quietly, and he actually relaxed when I did that. It was really interesting.
Well, Nancie, I'm mindful of time. And okay. So I'm gonna resolve us. But I just want to say thank you for this information this morning and this conversation. And mostly I want to say thank you for your service as a hospice care nurse. The work that you do is incredibly special. It's also very sacred. And I just want to say thank you on behalf of the families and the people that you cared for and comforted in the last stage of life. And thank you for your service.
Well, it's my pleasure. It really was my pleasure and my privilege. It was it was part of me that it was the best job I ever had.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you all for listening. And we're aware that we are over time this morning. I just want to remind folks that we're not cutting anything out of the service. We're going to go all the way through. So if you're getting antsy, please just sit tight with us because we're doing church. So
if anybody has any questions about the process and about other things about dying, get a hold of me. I'd be glad to talk to you about it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Jess, will you lead us in hymn number 192, Nay, Do Not Grieve?